Isim story. The whiskey bottle shattered against the saloon wall just as Clara Bennett stepped through the door, and every eye in the room turned to watch her face drain of color. It was the third day of relentless gossip that had swept through Silver Ridge, Montana territory, like wildfire in the summer of 1882, and Clara could feel the weight of their stares burning into her skin. She had come to town to collect her mail and purchase supplies for the boarding house she ran on the edge of town. But the hostile silence that greeted her made it clear that her simple errands would be anything but simple today. The lies had started small, whispers at first, but they had grown into a roaring storm that threatened to destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. Clara held her head high as she walked toward the general store, her boots clicking against the wooden planks of the sidewalk. She could hear the whispers following her like shadows. Words like shameful and disgraceful, and worse things she tried not to hear. It had all started 3 days ago when Margaret Hutchins, the banker's wife and the most influential woman in Silver Ridge, had seen Clara leaving the hotel at dawn. The truth was innocent enough. Clara had been tending to old Mrs. Patterson, who had taken ill during her stay, sitting up with her through the night to make sure she did not worsen. But Margaret had not bothered to learn the truth before spreading her poison. Instead, she had told everyone who would listen that Clara had been sneaking out of a man's room, that she was no better than the women who worked at the dance halls down by the railroad tracks. The general store fell silent when Clara entered, and even Mr. Morrison, who had always been kind to her, looked uncomfortable as he filled her order. She could see Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Cole whispering in the corner, their heads bent together like conspirators. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she counted out her money, but she refused to let them see her cry. She had done nothing wrong, and she would not be ashamed of herself no matter what they said. When she left the store with her parcels, she nearly collided with a tall man in dusty trail clothes who was tying his horse to the hitching post. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was deep and pleasant, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas origins. Clara looked up into a pair of striking blue eyes set in a sun-weathered face. He had dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and a strong jaw shadowed with several days of stubble. There was something honest in his expression, something that made her feel seen as a person rather than judged as a scandal. "No harm done," Clara replied quietly, stepping around him. She was eager to get back to her boarding house, where she could be alone, away from the cruel stares and whispers. "You dropped this," the man called after her, holding up a small package that had slipped from her arms. Clara turned back, embarrassed, and took it from him with a murmured thanks. As their fingers briefly touched, she felt an unexpected warmth, but she pushed the feeling away. She had no time for such things, not when her entire life was falling apart around her. The man watched her go with a thoughtful expression on his face. His name was James Cordell, and he had just arrived in Silver Ridge after spending 6 months driving cattle from Texas to Montana. He was tired, dusty, and looking forward to a hot meal and a soft bed, but something about the sadness in the woman's eyes stayed with him as he entered the general store. He noticed immediately that the atmosphere was charged with gossip, and within minutes of making his own purchases, he heard all about the scandalous Clara Bennett and her supposed moral failings. James listened with growing irritation as Mrs. Henderson detailed the story with obvious relish. He had seen enough of the world to know that gossip was often cruel and rarely accurate. The woman he had just met outside had not looked like someone of loose morals. She had looked tired and hurt, like someone carrying a burden she did not deserve. When Mrs. Henderson finally paused for breath, James spoke up in his calm, measured way. "Seems like a lot of talk about something nobody actually saw," he observed, leaning against the counter. The store went quiet again, and several pairs of eyes turned to examine this stranger who dared question their certainty. "I beg your pardon?" Mrs. Henderson said, drawing herself up indignantly. Margaret Hutchins saw her with her own eyes leaving the hotel at an unseemly hour. Saw her leaving the hotel? James repeated. That is not the same as knowing why she was there. Could be 100 innocent reasons for a woman to be at a hotel early in the morning. Mr. Morrison coughed uncomfortably. The stranger has a point, ladies. Clara Bennett has always been a respectable woman. She runs that boarding house honest and fair, and I have never heard a word against her until now. Well, I never, Mrs. Cole huffed. Where there is smoke, there is fire. That is what I always say. James picked up his purchases and headed for the door, but he paused before leaving. In my experience, ma'am, sometimes smoke just means somebody is blowing hot air. He left before she could respond, but he could hear the indignant sputtering behind him. Over the next few days, James found himself thinking about Clara Bennett more than he should. He had taken a room at the Silver Ridge Hotel, and he made inquiries about the woman who had become the subject of so much ugly gossip. What he learned only increased his respect for her. Clara had come to Montana Territory 5 years earlier after her parents died, using her small inheritance to purchase the rundown boarding house. She had worked tirelessly to make it respectable, taking in travelers and working men who needed clean rooms and honest meals. She had never given anyone reason to doubt her character until Margaret Hutchins decided to destroy her reputation. James also learned that Margaret Hutchins had her own reasons for targeting Clara. Apparently, Margaret's son had expressed interest in courting Clara the previous year, but Clara had gently refused him. Margaret had taken the rejection as a personal insult, and she had been looking for an opportunity to strike back ever since. The incident at the hotel had given her the perfect weapon. On his 4th day in Silver Ridge, James rode out to Clara's boarding house. It was a sturdy 2-story building painted white with green shutters, sitting on a piece of land with a vegetable garden and a small barn. The place had an air of quiet dignity about it, well maintained despite its age. He knocked on the door and waited, holding his hat in his hands. Clara opened the door herself, and her expression shifted from polite inquiry to guarded suspicion when she recognized him. Yes? No. Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is James Cordell. I am looking for a room to let, and I heard you have the best boarding house in Silver Ridge. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. I am sure the hotel in town would suit you better, Mr. Cordell. They have rooms available. I prefer a quieter place, James said honestly, and I prefer to give my business to someone who is being treated unfairly. For a moment, Clara's careful composure cracked, and he saw raw emotion flash across her face, surprise, gratitude, and a desperate hope that she quickly tried to hide. You do not know anything about me or my situation as I know. I know gossip when I hear it, James replied. And I know the difference between facts and speculation. I also know that you were tending to Mrs. Patterson that night. I spoke with her granddaughter yesterday. She was very grateful for the care you provided. Clara's breath caught in her throat. You spoke with Sarah? I did. She told me her grandmother had taken ill with chest pains, and you sat up with her all night, giving her medicine and keeping watch. Mrs. Patterson wanted everyone to know the truth, but apparently Margaret Hutchins has been doing her best to make sure the truth does not spread as fast as the lies. Tears welled up in Clara's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. Why would you do this? Why would you care about a stranger's reputation? James met her gaze steadily. Because I have seen good people destroyed by lies, and I have learned that sometimes all it takes for evil to win is for good people to stay silent. I do not intend to stay silent, Miss Bennett. Clara opened the door wider, her hand trembling slightly. Come in, Mr. Cordell. I have a room available on the 2nd floor. Over the following weeks, James became Clara's most vocal defender. He took every opportunity to tell the true story of that night, speaking to anyone who would listen. He found Sarah Patterson and encouraged her to speak publicly about her grandmother's illness and Clara's kindness. Slowly, painfully, the truth began to spread through Silver Ridge, competing with the lies that had taken root so quickly. But Margaret Hutchins was not ready to admit defeat. She doubled down on her accusations, adding new embellishments to her story. She claimed she had seen Clara with a man, though she conveniently could not identify who the man was. She suggested that Clara's boarding house was a front for immoral activities. The lies became more vicious and more desperate as Margaret realized she was losing control of the narrative. James was in the saloon one evening when he overheard Margaret's son, Thomas Hutchins, making crude remarks about Clara. Thomas was drunk and belligerent, encouraged by several other young men who found sport in tearing down a woman's reputation. James set down his whiskey glass and walked over to their table. "That is enough," he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. Thomas looked up with bleary eyes. "Who are you to tell me what is enough? This is none of your business, stranger." "I am making it my business," James replied. "You are talking about a good woman who did nothing to deserve your disrespect. I suggest you apologize and keep your mouth shut." Thomas lurched to his feet, swaying slightly. "You defending your woman, Cowboy? Everyone knows you are staying at her place. Maybe the gossip is true after all." James felt anger rise in his chest, hot and fierce, but he kept his voice level. "The only gossip here is coming from you and your mother. Now apologize, or I will make you apologize." The saloon had gone quiet, all eyes on the confrontation. Thomas glanced around, saw that he had an audience, and made the mistake of throwing a punch. James dodged easily and caught Thomas's arm, twisting it behind his back and forcing the younger man to his knees. It was over in seconds, a display of skill and control that left no doubt about who was in charge. "Apologize," James repeated, applying just enough pressure to make his point. "I apologize," Thomas gasped out. "I apologize." James released him and stepped back. "If I hear you or anyone else spreading lies about Miss Bennet, we will have this conversation again, and I will not be so gentle. That goes for everyone here." He walked out of the saloon, leaving shocked silence behind him. The story of the confrontation spread through town even faster than the original gossip had, and it changed something in the atmosphere of Silver Ridge. People began to question the accusations more openly. If a stranger was willing to defend Clara Bennet so fiercely, perhaps there was more to the story than they had been told. Clara heard about the incident the next morning from Mrs. Jensen, one of her long-term boarders. The older woman had remained loyal throughout the scandal, and she took great satisfaction in describing how James had handled Thomas Hutchins. "That young man of yours is quite something," Mrs. Jensen said with a knowing smile. "Not many men would stand up to the Hutchins family like that." "He is not my young man," Clara protested, feeling her cheeks flush. "He is simply a boarder." "None." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Jensen said, but her tone suggested she did not believe it for a moment. The truth was that Clara had been trying very hard not to think about James Cordell in any romantic way. He was handsome, kind, and brave, everything a woman could want. But she had built walls around her heart after years of focusing solely on survival and respectability. She could not afford to care for someone, especially not now when her reputation was already in tatters. What would people say if she began courting someone in the middle of this scandal? But her heart did not seem to care about practicality. Every morning when James came down to breakfast, her pulse quickened. Every evening when they sat on the porch together, talking about their lives and dreams, she felt herself falling a little deeper. James had a way of listening that made her feel valued, and when he looked at her, she did not see judgment or suspicion. She saw admiration and something else. Something tender that both thrilled and terrified her. James was fighting his own battle with his feelings. He had not planned to fall in love when he came to Silver Ridge. He had been planning to rest for a few weeks before moving on to his next job, perhaps finding work on one of the ranches in the area. But Clara had changed everything. She was strong and dignified, refusing to be broken by the cruelty of others. She was kind, always thinking of her boarder's comfort before her own. And she was beautiful, though he suspected she did not realize it herself. He knew he should leave before his feelings grew any stronger, but he could not abandon her while she was still fighting for her reputation. So he stayed, and every day made it harder to imagine leaving at all. The turning point came 3 weeks after James had arrived in Silver Ridge. Sarah Patterson organized a town meeting at the church, inviting everyone to hear the truth about the night her grandmother had been ill. Mrs. Patterson herself, now fully recovered, stood before the congregation and told them exactly what had happened. She described how Clara had stayed by her side all night, how she had administered medicine and cold compresses, how she had possibly saved her life. "I am ashamed," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice ringing out strong and clear despite her age. "You're ashamed that this community allowed lies to flourish while the truth was ignored. Clara Bennett is a woman of exemplary character, and anyone who says otherwise is either a liar or a fool." Ninon. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence, and then Mr. Morrison stood up. "Mrs. Patterson is right. I have known Clara for 5 years, and she has never been anything but honest and hardworking. I should have spoken up sooner, and I apologize for my cowardice." One by one, other people stood to voice their support. The tide was turning finally, and Clara sat in the back of the church with tears streaming down her face. James sat beside her, and when she reached for his hand, he held it tightly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture of comfort and something more. Margaret Hutchins tried to interrupt, tried to cast doubt on the testimonies, but she was shouted down. The community had made its decision, and they had chosen truth over gossip. Margaret left the church in fury, her husband following behind her with a defeated expression. After the meeting, Clara was surrounded by well-wishers, people apologizing for their treatment of her and praising her character. She accepted their apologies with grace, though James could see the exhaustion in her eyes. When they finally made it back to the boarding house, Clara sank onto the porch steps and let out a long, shaky breath. "It is over," she whispered. "It is finally over." James sat down beside her, their shoulders touching. "You were very brave." "I was terrified," Clara admitted. "If you had not been here, if you had not stood up for me, I do not know what would have happened. I might have lost everything. No. You would have survived," James said with conviction. "You are stronger than you know, Clara Bennett." She turned to look at him, really look at him, and saw the emotion in his eyes. "Why did you do it? Why did you risk making enemies in a town where you were a stranger?" James reached up and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Because from the moment I met you, I could not stop thinking about you, because you deserve to have someone fight for you, because I am falling in love with you, and I could not stand by and watch them destroy you." Clara's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "James, I cannot ask you to stay. You have your own life, your own plans." "Then do not ask," James said softly. "Let me choose. Let me choose you, Clara. Let me choose this life, this place, if you will have me." "I am afraid," Clara whispered. "I am afraid that this is too good to be true, that I will wake up and find it was all a dream." James leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, his hand cradling the back of her neck. "This is real. What I feel for you is real. Give me a chance to prove it." Clara closed the distance between them and kissed him, pouring all of her fear and hope and love into that single moment. James responded immediately, his arms wrapping around her and pulling her close. The kiss was tender and passionate, a promise of everything they could be together. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Clara laughed through her tears. "I love you too. I have been trying so hard not to, but I love you, James Cordell." "Then stop trying," James said with a grin. "Love me with everything you have, because that is exactly what I intend to do." The next few months were the happiest of Clara's life. James found work on a nearby ranch, but he continued to live at the boarding house, courting Clara properly despite the fact that they both knew where their relationship was heading. He brought her wildflowers and took her on picnics by the river. He helped her with repairs around the property and sat with her in the evenings, reading aloud from books or simply talking about their days. The scandal faded from memory as new events captured the town's attention. Margaret Hutchins became increasingly isolated as people realized the extent of her lies. Eventually, her husband moved the family to Helena, unable to bear the social stigma his wife had brought upon them. Clara felt a moment of pity for Margaret, understanding that bitterness and pride had driven her to such cruelty, but she did not dwell on it. She was too busy being happy. James proposed on a crisp autumn evening, 6 months after they had first met. They were sitting on the porch swing, wrapped in blankets against the cooling air when he pulled a simple gold ring from his pocket. "I know I do not have much to offer," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I am just a cowboy with some savings and a lot of dreams. But I promise to spend every day of my life making you happy, if you will marry me, Clara." And Clara did not hesitate. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. They were married in the same church where Clara's reputation had been restored, with most of Silver Ridge in attendance. Mrs. Patterson cried happy tears and pressed a beautiful quilt into Clara's hands, a wedding gift she had been working on for months. Mr. Morrison gave Clara away, and Mrs. Jensen sang a hymn in her wavering but heartfelt voice. It was a simple ceremony, but it was perfect. James and Clara continued to run the boarding house together, with James taking on the heavier repairs and helping to expand the business. They added more rooms and built a larger barn, and the boarding house became known throughout the territory as one of the finest places to stay. But more importantly, it became a home filled with love and laughter. 2 years after their wedding, Clara gave birth to a son they named Thomas, after James's father. James held his son for the first time with tears in his eyes, marveling at the tiny perfect features and the strong grip of little fingers around his thumb. "He is beautiful," James whispered, looking up at Clara with such love that it took her breath away. "You are amazing." Clara reached out and touched her husband's face, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "We made him together. We made this life together." Thomas was followed 2 years later by a daughter named Rose, who had her mother's determination and her father's blue eyes. The boarding house rang with the sounds of children playing, and Clara sometimes had to pinch herself to believe that this was her life. The woman who had once stood alone against a town's condemnation now had a family and a community that loved and respected her. James proved to be a wonderful father, patient and playful with his children. He taught Thomas to ride and rope, passing on the cowboy skills he had learned in his own youth. He read bedtime stories to Rose and braided her hair with surprising gentleness, and through it all, he never stopped courting Clara, never stopped making her feel cherished and desired. On their 5th anniversary, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Clara reflected on how much her life had changed. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked James softly. "Staying here, giving up the freedom of the trail?" James pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Not for a single second. You are my freedom, Clara. You and our children, this life we have built together. This is everything I ever wanted, even when I did not know I wanted it." "I was so scared," Clara admitted. "When the gossip started, I thought my life was over. I thought I had lost everything in mine. But you survived," James reminded her. "You stood strong, and the truth won out in the end." "Because you fought for me," Clara said, turning in his arms to face him. "Because you saw me when everyone else had already made up their minds. You saved me, James." "No," James said firmly, cupping her face in his hands. "You saved yourself by being the kind of person worth fighting for. I just made sure everyone else could see what I saw from the beginning. A woman of courage, integrity, and strength. A woman I am honored to love." They kissed in the darkness, a kiss that still held all the passion and promise of their first kiss on the porch steps. Some things, Clara thought, only got better with time. The years passed gently in Silver Ridge. Thomas grew into a strong, honest young man who helped run the ranch that James eventually purchased with their savings. Rose became a teacher, bringing education to the children of the territory with the same determination her mother had shown in rebuilding her reputation. James and Clara grew older together, their hair turning gray, but their love remaining constant. They added a third child to their family, another daughter named Hope, born when Clara was 35. Hope was a surprise and a blessing, a reminder that life still held wonderful things even as they aged. She was spirited and fearless, always trailing after her older siblings and demanding to be included in everything. Clara never forgot the dark days when lies had threatened to destroy her, but she no longer felt any bitterness about that time. It had brought James into her life, and it had taught her that truth and goodness could prevail even in the face of malicious gossip. She made it her mission to defend others who were unfairly accused, using her own experience to speak up for those who had no voice. When Mrs. Jensen passed away at the age of 82, she left a letter for Clara that made her weep. In it, the old woman wrote about how proud she was of the life Clara had built, and how witnessing her courage had inspired Mrs. Jensen to be braver in her own life. It was a reminder that every action, every stand for truth and justice, had ripples that spread far beyond what could be seen. James and Clara celebrated their 25th anniversary surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Thomas had married a rancher's daughter and given them 2 grandsons who were already showing signs of being excellent horsemen. Rose had married a fellow teacher, and together they had opened a school that served families throughout the region. Hope, at 20, was being courted by a young lawyer who treated her with the respect and adoration she deserved. As James and Clara stood together on the porch of their home, the same porch where they had first admitted their love, they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you remember the day we met?" Clara asked, leaning into her husband's embrace. "You were so dusty and tired, and I was so desperate to escape the cruel stares. I remember thinking you had the saddest eyes I'd ever seen," James said. "And I remember deciding right then that I wanted to make you smile." "No. You've made me smile every day since," Clara said, turning to kiss him softly. "You have given me a life beyond my wildest dreams." "And we gave each other that life," James corrected. "You taught me what it means to have a home, to belong somewhere. Before I met you, I was just drifting. You gave me purpose, Clara. You gave me everything." They stood together as the sun set over the Montana landscape, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The boarding house behind them was full of guests, the barn full of horses, and the air full of the sounds of family and community. It was a life built on truth, defended by courage, and sustained by love. Clara thought about the young woman she had been, standing alone against a tide of gossip and lies. She thought about the cowboy who had chosen to defend her when he had no reason to care. And she thought about how one act of courage, one decision to stand up for truth, had changed both of their lives forever. "Thank you," she whispered to James. "Thank you for seeing me, for believing in me, for loving me." James held her close, his heart full to bursting. "Thank you for letting me. Thank you for giving me the greatest adventure of my life." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, James and Clara Cordell stood together, 2 people who had found love in the midst of hardship and had built something beautiful from the ashes of lies. Their reputation in Silver Ridge was beyond reproach now, but more importantly, they had each other. They had their family, their home, and a love that had weathered every storm. The gossip that had once threatened to destroy Clara had become nothing more than a distant memory, a cautionary tale about the dangers of judging too quickly and believing lies over truth. But for Clara and James, it was also the beginning of their love story, the catalyst that had brought them together and shown them what really mattered in life. In the end, truth had won out, just as James had always believed it would, And love, that most powerful force of all, had conquered everything else. As they walked back into their home, hand in hand, Clara and James knew that they had found what everyone searches for: a love that endures, a truth that sustains, and a life that was worth every struggle it had taken to achieve. Their children and grandchildren would carry forward the lessons they had learned: stand up for truth, defend the innocent, and never underestimate the power of love to transform lives. The legacy of that summer in 1882, when a cowboy defended a woman against lies and gossip, would echo through generations, a testament to the courage it takes to do what is right and the rewards that come from following your heart. Years later, when Clara was in her 70s and James had passed quietly in his sleep at the age of 76, she would sit on that same porch and tell her grandchildren the story of how she and their grandfather had met. She would tell them about the dark days when lies had threatened everything, and about the brave cowboy who had stood up for truth when no one else would. And she would tell them that love, real love, was worth fighting for, worth defending, worth everything. But that was still years in the future. For now, on this perfect evening in Montana Territory, James and Clara Cordell simply held each other and counted their blessings, grateful for the day a broken whiskey bottle had brought them together and changed their lives forever. They had survived the storm of gossip and lies, and they had emerged stronger, their love tested and proven true. It was, Clara thought, as she drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, the very best kind of happy ending, one they had earned together through courage, faith, and an unshakable belief in each other. The truth had won out. Love had triumphed, and their story would be remembered long after they were gone. A reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the darkest moments, when one person decides to stand up and fight for what is right. Description: in 1882 Montana Territory, Clara Bennett's reputation is destroyed by vicious lies when she's seen leaving a hotel at dawn. The whole town turns against her based on gossip, not knowing she'd spent the night caring for an ill elderly woman. When cowboy James Cordell arrives in Silver Ridge, he recognizes the injustice and makes it his mission to defend her honor and uncover the truth, even as powerful forces work to silence him. As James fights to restore Clara's good name, an unexpected love blossoms between them. Together they battle small-town prejudice and malicious gossip, proving that truth and courage can overcome even the cruelest lies, and that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with one person willing to stand up for what's right. Witness a powerful tale of justice, redemption, and enduring love in the Wild West.